Marcus Wellington had always believed that controversy was the fastest path to political success. At 42 years old, he had spent the last decade climbing the ranks of local politics in his small English constituency, never missing an opportunity to create a spectacle that would land him in the newspapers. His office walls were covered with newspaper clippings, each headline featuring his name in bold letters, each story documenting another outrageous stunt designed to grab public attention. The morning of September 15th started like any other for Marcus. He sat in his cramped office above the bakery on High Street, scrolling through social media and reading the morning news. His assistant, Jenny, knocked on the door with his usual cup of black coffee and a stack of mail that nobody would bother opening until next week. "The polls are still showing you trailing by 12 points, Jenny said, setting the coffee down carefully on his cluttered desk. She had worked for Marcus for 3 years and had grown tired of his increasingly desperate attempts to stay relevant. In a political landscape that seemed to be moving on without him, Marcus barely looked up from his phone. The latest celebrity scandal was trending, and he felt that familiar pang of jealousy that someone else was getting all the attention. 12 points, he muttered, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's nothing, one good headline and we're back in the game." Jenny rolled her eyes and turned to leave, but Marcus called her back. "Cancel my meetings for today. I need to think of something big, something that will get everyone talking." For the next 2 hours, Marcus paced around his small office, brainstorming ideas that ranged from the ridiculous to the downright illegal. He considered staging a protest outside the mayor's office, organizing a flash mob in the town square, or perhaps calling for the removal of a local statue that nobody had ever really noticed before. But none of these ideas felt big enough, dramatic enough to capture the kind of attention he desperately needed. It was while scrolling through news articles about the royal family that inspiration struck. He read about the upcoming visit of Prince Edward to the nearby military base, where he would be inspecting the Queen's Guard as part of a ceremonial parade. The event was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus knew it would attract significant media coverage from both local and national news outlets. Marcus had always harbored a deep resentment toward the monarchy, not because of any particular political ideology, but because they represented everything he felt he deserved but could never achieve. They had wealth, respect, and most importantly, they had constant media attention without ever having to work for it. Every public appearance was front-page news. Every word they spoke was analyzed and discussed by millions of people. As he stared at the photograph of Prince Edward in his military uniform, surrounded by the stoic figures of the Queen's Guard, in their iconic red tunics and tall black hats, Marcus began to formulate a plan. The Guards were famous for their discipline and their absolute refusal to react to any provocation. Tourists from around the world would try to make them laugh, move, or break character, but they stood like statues, completely unmoved by any external influence. What if, Marcus thought to himself, someone actually tried to physically provoke one of them? The idea was outrageous, potentially dangerous, and absolutely guaranteed to generate headlines. He imagined the newspaper stories, the television, interviews, the social media discussions that would follow. Even if the reaction was negative, even if people criticized him, at least they would be talking about him. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon researching everything he could about the Queen's Guard. He learned about their rigorous training, their dedication to duty, and their impressive physical capabilities. Most of the guards were active military personnel, trained in combat, and conditioned to handle high-stress situations. But Marcus convinced himself that their training would prevent them from actually fighting back. They were supposed to be disciplined, professional, and above all, restrained in their reactions to civilian provocations. By evening, Marcus had convinced himself that his plan was foolproof. He would attend the ceremony, wait for the perfect moment when all the cameras were rolling, and then stage some kind of physical confrontation with one of the guards. Nothing too violent, of course, just enough to create a scene and ensure that his name would be in every newspaper and on every news program for weeks to come. He called Jenny at home and told her to clear his schedule for the next week. "I'm going to do something that will change everything," he said, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. "This time next month, Everyone in the country will know my name. Jenny had heard this kind of talk before, and she was beginning to worry about where Marcus's desperation might lead him. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, but Marcus had already hung up the phone. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and imagining how his confrontation with the Royal Guard would play out. He pictured himself as a brave defender of democratic values, standing up to the outdated symbols of an oppressive monarchy. He saw himself giving passionate interviews about the need for political change, positioning himself as a voice for the common people against the privileged elite. In his fantasies, the incident would catapult him to national prominence. Political parties would compete for his endorsement, news programs would invite him as a regular commentator, and his polling numbers would skyrocket as voters rallied behind his bold stance against the establishment. But as the night wore on, and morning approached, Marcus never once considered the possibility that his carefully planned publicity stunt might not go according to plan. He never imagined that the highly trained, physically capable members of the Queen's Guard might not react the way he expected them to, and he certainly never considered that his desperate grab for attention might end with him lying on the ground, with blood streaming down his face, regretting every decision that had led him to that moment. The week leading up to the royal visit passed in a blur of nervous energy and increasingly elaborate planning. Marcus spent his days researching every detail of the upcoming ceremony, studying photographs of previous royal inspections, and timing his approach down to the second. He had convinced himself that timing would be everything. He needed to create his scene at the exact moment when the most cameras would be focused on the guards, ensuring maximum coverage of whatever confrontation he managed to provoke. Marcus drove to the military base 3 times during the week, ostensibly to survey the area, but really to feed his growing obsession with the plan. Each visit made him more confident that he could pull off his stunt without serious consequences. The guards he observed during these reconnaissance trips seemed almost robotic in their discipline, standing perfectly still despite the distractions of curious tourists and the occasional barking dog. "They're trained not to react," he told himself repeatedly. "They can't break protocol no matter what happens." Jenny grew increasingly concerned about her employer's behavior. Marcus had become secretive and jumpy, spending hours on phone calls that he would end abruptly whenever she entered the room. When she tried to discuss his upcoming schedule or the campaign strategies they had been developing, he would wave her off impatiently and return to whatever mysterious project was consuming all his attention. "You've been acting strange all week," she finally confronted him on Thursday afternoon. "What exactly are you planning for the royal visit? And don't tell me it's just a photo opportunity, because I know you better than that." Marcus looked up from the detailed map of the military base he had been studying and gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "It's going to be fine, Jenny. Better than fine. It's going to be the moment that changes everything for us. For the campaign, for our future, for everything." But Jenny wasn't convinced. She had seen Marcus take risks before, but there was something different about his demeanor this time. He seemed almost manic in his excitement, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was planning would end badly for everyone involved. On Friday evening, Marcus made his final preparations. He chose his outfit carefully, a simple, dark suit that would look dignified in photographs, but not so formal that it would seem out of place among the crowd of spectators. He practiced different approaches to the guards, trying to decide whether to push, grab, or simply stand in their way until they were forced to respond. The more he rehearsed his various scenarios, the more convinced he became that his plan was brilliant. He imagined the headlines that would follow: "Local politician stands up to royal authority," or "Democratic hero challenges outdated traditions." He pictured himself giving interviews from his hospital bed if necessary, describing his noble sacrifice in the name of political progress. Marcus also spent considerable time crafting the statement he would give to the press immediately after the incident. He wanted to be ready with quotable sound bites that would frame the confrontation in terms of his political principles rather than personal desperation. He practiced phrases like symbolic resistance to unelected authority and standing with the common people against aristocratic privilege. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. Marcus woke up early, despite having barely slept, and spent an hour in front of the mirror perfecting his appearance. He wanted to look serious but approachable, determined but not threatening. Every detail mattered because he knew that the photographs taken today would define how the public perceived him for years to come. At breakfast, Marcus could barely eat. His stomach was twisted with a combination of excitement and anxiety that made food seem impossible to swallow. He kept checking his phone for updates about the royal visit, reading every news article and social media post about the upcoming ceremony. The coverage was already extensive, with reporters from major networks planning to broadcast live from the event. "This is it," Marcus whispered to himself as he straightened his tie one final time. "This is my moment." The drive to the military base took 40 minutes, and Marcus spent the entire journey mentally rehearsing his plan. He had timed everything perfectly. He would arrive just as the crowd was gathering, but before security became too tight. He would position himself in the optimal location for camera coverage, wait for Prince Edward to begin his inspection of the guards, and then make his move. As he pulled into the parking area near the base, Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline unlike
anything he had ever experienced. The lot was already filling with cars, and he could see news vans setting up their equipment in the designated media area.
Local police officers were directing traffic and establishing security perimeters, but Marcus noticed that the civilian viewing area was still relatively accessible. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped out of his car. He could see the ceremonial area in the distance, where workers were making final preparations for the prince's arrival. The Queen's Guard was already in position, their red uniforms brilliant against the green grass of the parade ground. They stood in perfect formation, rifles held at precise angles, their famous bearskin hats adding an impressive height to their already imposing figures. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of doubt. The guards looked even more intimidating in person than they had in photographs. These were not the tourist-friendly sentries he had seen at Buckingham Palace, trained to ignore the antics of sightseers. These were active military personnel, combat-trained soldiers who had been selected for their physical capabilities as much as their ceremonial duties. But Marcus pushed these concerns aside. He had come too far and invested too much in this plan to back down now. His political career, his financial future, and his personal reputation were all riding on what happened in the next few hours. Failure was not an option. He made his way toward the viewing area, nodding politely to the other spectators who had gathered for the ceremony. Many of them were local residents who had come out to catch a glimpse of royalty, elderly couples with small cameras and families with excited children. Marcus felt a pang of guilt as he realized that his planned disruption would ruin their innocent enjoyment of the event. But he quickly suppressed these feelings. "Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet," he muttered to himself, borrowing a phrase he had heard more successful politicians use to justify their controversial decisions. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock, and by 10:30 the viewing area was packed with spectators. Marcus had managed to position himself in the perfect spot, close enough to the ceremonial area to make a quick dash toward the guards, but far enough from the main security checkpoint to avoid immediate detection. He stood among a group of elderly women who had brought folding chairs and thermoses of tea, chatting excitedly about the last time they had seen a member of the royal family. "Such a handsome young man, Prince Edward," one of them was saying, "and so dedicated to his military duties. My grandson was hoping to join the Queen's Guard someday, but the training is so demanding." Marcus nodded politely, but his attention was focused on the guards themselves. 6 of them stood in perfect formation about 50 yards away, their rifles gleaming in the morning sunlight. Their discipline was remarkable. Despite the growing crowd and increasing activity around them, they remained absolutely motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead as if the hundreds of spectators didn't exist. The media presence was even more extensive than Marcus had hoped. He could count at least 8 television cameras, including crews from BBC, ITV, and Sky News. Several photographers with professional equipment had positioned themselves at various angles around the ceremonial area, and he noticed that many of the spectators were holding up phones to record the proceedings. At exactly 11 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up to the entrance of the ceremonial area. Prince Edward emerged, wearing his military dress uniform with its array of medals and ceremonial decorations. He was accompanied by several high-ranking military officers and what appeared to be a small security detail of plainclothes officers who immediately began scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as the prince began his slow walk toward the line of guards. This was the moment he had been planning for, the culmination of weeks of preparation and years of political frustration. Everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of achieving, would be decided in the next few minutes. The prince moved with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ceremony dozens of times. He paused before each guard, exchanging a few quiet words with the commanding officer who accompanied him, occasionally nodding in appreciation of some detail of their presentation. The cameras followed his every move, and Marcus could see the red recording lights blinking on equipment throughout the viewing area. Now or never, Marcus whispered to himself. He began to move forward, stepping carefully around the elderly women with their chairs and pushing gently past a family with young children who were trying to get a better view. His approach was slow and deliberate, designed to avoid drawing attention from security until it was too late for them to intervene. The commanding officer was explaining some detail about the guards' training when Marcus made his final move. He ducked under the rope barrier that separated the viewing area from the ceremonial space and broke into a run toward the line of guards. His plan was to reach the guard at the far end of the formation, the one who was positioned furthest from Prince Edward and his security detail. For a moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Marcus could hear shouts from the security officers and see the sudden movement of cameras swinging in his direction. The commanding officer stepped forward as if to intercept him, but Marcus was already past the prince and heading directly toward his target. The guard he had chosen was a tall, powerfully built man named Sergeant James Mitchell. At 28 years old, Mitchell had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been selected for the Queen's Guard, based not only on his ceremonial bearing, but also on his proven ability to handle high-stress situations with both discipline and decisive action when necessary. Marcus had expected the guard to remain motionless, bound by his training to maintain his ceremonial posture no matter what provocation he faced. But as Marcus reached him and raised his hand to push against the guard's chest, he realized that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Queen's Guard training. Sergeant Mitchell's training had indeed taught him to remain disciplined and professional in the face of minor distractions and tourist antics, but it had also taught him to instantly recognize genuine threats and to respond to them with appropriate force. A running man who had broken through security barriers and was now physically attacking a member of the Queen's Guard during a royal ceremony was not a minor distraction. It was a clear and immediate threat that required immediate neutralization. Marcus's hand had barely made contact with the guard's uniform when Mitchell moved. The response was swift, precise, and devastating. In its effectiveness, Mitchell's training kicked in automatically, his body responding to the threat with movements that had been drilled into him through countless hours of combat preparation. The guard's left hand shot up to grab Marcus's wrist, while his right elbow drove upward in a sharp, controlled movement that caught Marcus squarely in the face. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus felt his nose explode in a burst of pain and blood, and his vision filled with stars as his legs gave out beneath him. The entire confrontation lasted less than 3 seconds. One moment Marcus was running toward what he believed would be his moment of political glory, and the next he was lying on the ground with blood streaming down his face, while Sergeant Mitchell had already returned to his ceremonial position as if nothing had happened. The cameras had captured everything: the sudden movement as Marcus broke from the crowd, his desperate sprint toward the guard, and the swift professional response that left him crumpled on the grass while the ceremony continued around him. Within seconds, security officers had surrounded Marcus, and medical personnel who had been standing by for the royal visit were rushing toward him with first aid equipment. Prince Edward, to his credit, handled the situation with remarkable composure. After a brief consultation with his security detail, he continued with the ceremony, as if the interruption had been a minor inconvenience rather than a serious breach of protocol. The other guards never moved from their positions. Their discipline and training evident in their complete focus on their duties despite the chaos that had erupted just yards away from them. As Marcus lay on the ground, trying to comprehend what had just happened to him, he could hear the murmur of the crowd and see the flash of cameras documenting his humiliation. This was not at all how he had imagined his moment in the spotlight would unfold. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but for Marcus, those minutes felt like hours of excruciating embarrassment. He lay on the ground with a paramedic pressing gauze against his nose, trying to stem the flow of blood while photographers captured every humiliating angle of his situation. The pain in his face was intense, but the pain to his dignity was far worse. "Can you tell me your name, sir?" the paramedic asked, shining a small flashlight in Marcus's eyes to check for signs of concussion. "Marcus Wellington," he managed to mumble through the blood and swelling. "I'm a local councillor." Even in his current state, he couldn't resist mentioning his political position, though he was beginning to realize that his political career might be over before the day was out. The paramedic nodded professionally. "Well, Mr. Wellington, you've got a broken nose and possibly a mild concussion. We need to get you to the hospital for proper treatment and some x-rays." As they loaded Marcus onto a stretcher, he could see that the royal ceremony was continuing without interruption. Prince Edward had moved on to inspect the next guard in line, and the crowd's attention had largely returned to the official proceedings. Only a few spectators were still looking in his direction, and most of them seemed more curious than sympathetic. The ride to the hospital gave Marcus his first opportunity to truly comprehend the magnitude of his miscalculation. As the paramedics worked to stabilize his condition, he could hear the radio chatter from the police officers who were following the ambulance. Words like assault on a royal guard, breach of security, and potential charges drifted through his consciousness like a nightmare. At the hospital, Marcus was taken directly to the emergency room, where a doctor confirmed that his nose was indeed broken in 2 places. The injury would require surgery to repair properly, and he would need to wear protective splints for several weeks. More immediately concerning, however, were the police officers who were waiting outside his treatment room with questions about his actions at the ceremony. Detective Inspector Sarah Hayes introduced herself and explained that Marcus was being investigated for several potential charges, including assault on a military officer, breach of security during a royal event, and disturbing the peace. The seriousness in her voice made it clear that this was not going to be dismissed as a simple case of political theater gone wrong. "Mr. Wellington," Detective Hayes said, "I need to understand exactly what you were trying to accomplish today. This was clearly a premeditated action, and the consequences could be quite severe." Marcus tried to explain his intentions, but even to his own ears, his planned political protest sounded childish and desperate. "I wanted to make a statement about democratic values," he said weakly. "I thought the guard would just stand there." Detective Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You thought you could physically assault a member of the Queen's Guard during a royal ceremony, and there would be no consequences?" The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. Marcus had envisioned newspaper headlines about his brave stand against monarchy, but the actual headlines that were already being written told a very different story. His phone, which had been returned to him with his personal effects, was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters. But these were not the friendly interviews he had imagined. Jenny arrived at the hospital 3 hours after the incident, having driven straight from the campaign office after seeing the news reports. She found Marcus sitting up in bed with his nose heavily bandaged and his eyes blackened from the impact. The sight of him in this condition filled her with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "Marcus," she said, sitting down heavily in the visitor's chair, "what have you done?" "I tried to make a statement," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked any conviction. The events of the day had drained all his usual bluster and left him feeling small and foolish. Jenny pulled out her tablet and showed him the news coverage that was already flooding the internet. The headlines were even worse than he had feared. "Desperate politician attacks royal guard," "Local councillor humiliated in security breach," and "Broken nose, broken career, the rise and fall of Marcus Wellington." The video footage was devastating. Every major news outlet had obtained clear recordings of the incident, and they all showed the same embarrassing sequence of events. Marcus running toward the guard with obvious intent to cause trouble, followed by the swift and professional response that left him bleeding on the ground. There was no way to spin this as a noble political gesture or a principled stand against authority. "The party leadership has already called," Jenny said quietly. "They're meeting tomorrow to discuss your expulsion." The local party chairman said they can't be associated with someone who would attack a member of the military during a royal ceremony. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to process the full extent of the disaster he had created. His political career was over. His reputation was in ruins, and he was facing potential criminal charges that could result in prison time. All his careful planning, all his dreams of national prominence had resulted in nothing more than a few seconds of viral video that made him look like a deranged fool. The worst part was that the guard who had stopped him, Sergeant Mitchell, was being hailed as a hero in the same news stories that were destroying Marcus's life. Military spokespeople praised Mitchell's professionalism and restraint, noting that he had used exactly the appropriate level of force to neutralize the threat while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. Prince Edward himself had reportedly commended Mitchell for his quick thinking and disciplined response. "What am I going to do?" Marcus asked, more to himself than to Jenny. Jenny looked at her employer with a mixture of pity and exasperation. "You're going to face whatever consequences come from this, and you're going to hope that people eventually forget about it. But, Marcus, your political career is over. No one is ever going to take you seriously again after this." As if to emphasize her point, Marcus's phone buzzed with another call from a reporter. The caller ID showed that it was a journalist from a national tabloid, probably looking for quotes that would make the story even more sensational. Marcus declined the call, but he knew it wouldn't be the last one. Over the next few hours, as the pain medication began to wear off and the reality of his situation became clearer, Marcus realized that his desperate attempt to generate positive publicity had achieved exactly the opposite result. He had indeed made national headlines just as he had dreamed, but he was being portrayed as a laughingstock rather than a political visionary. The nursing staff had to restrict visitors to his room because reporters were trying to sneak in disguised as hospital personnel. Security guards were posted outside his door, not to protect him from threats, but to protect him from the media circus that his actions had created. Even from his hospital bed, Marcus could see that his moment in the spotlight was turning into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Marcus was discharged from the hospital the following Monday morning, but the media attention had only intensified over the weekend. As he left through the back exit, wearing dark sunglasses to hide his black eyes and a surgical mask to cover his bandaged nose, he could still hear reporters shouting questions from the front of the building. The drive home was a nightmare of recognition and humiliation. Even with his face partially covered, people on the street seemed to recognize him from the endless replays of the incident that had dominated news cycles for the past 3 days. Some pointed and laughed, while others shook their heads in disgust. A few took photos with their phones, adding to the growing collection of images that documented his fall from whatever grace he had once possessed. Marcus's small flat above the bakery had become a fortress under siege. Reporters camped outside the building, and his neighbors were becoming increasingly irritated with the disruption to their quiet street. Mrs. Henderson from the ground floor had already complained to his landlord about the noise and the strangers, constantly knocking on doors asking for information about the crazy politician upstairs. The legal consequences were mounting as quickly as the social ones. Detective Inspector Hayes had informed him that the Crown Prosecution Service was considering multiple charges, including assault on a military officer, which carried a potential prison sentence of up to 2 years. His solicitor, a nervous man named David Prentice, who usually handled property disputes and minor traffic violations, was clearly out of his depth with a case that had attracted national attention. "The problem," Prentice explained during their meeting on Tuesday afternoon, "is that everything was recorded. There's no ambiguity about what happened, no way to argue self-defense or mistaken intent. The video clearly shows you deliberately running toward the guard with the intention of making physical contact." Marcus sat across from his solicitor in the small, cluttered office, still wearing his sunglasses and surgical mask. The swelling in his face had gone down slightly, but the bruising had spread and darkened, giving him the appearance of someone who had lost a serious fight, which, he reflected bitterly, was exactly what had happened. "What about my political motivations?" Marcus asked desperately. "Surely the court will consider that I was trying to make a statement about democratic values." Prentice looked at him with barely concealed incredulity. "Mr. Wellington, you physically attacked a member of the military during a royal ceremony. No court in the country is going to view that as a legitimate form of political protest. If anything, your premeditation makes the charges more serious, not less." The political fallout had been swift and merciless. The local party had voted unanimously to expel Marcus from their ranks, issuing a statement that described his actions as completely contrary to our values of respect for public service and lawful democratic participation. The National Party leadership had gone further, suggesting that Marcus's behavior demonstrated a fundamental unfitness for any role in public life. More devastating still were the reactions from his former colleagues and supporters. Council members who had once sought his endorsement were now actively distancing themselves from any association with him. Local business owners who had donated to his campaigns were demanding refunds and publicly condemning his actions. Even, his most loyal supporters were abandoning him in droves. Jenny had submitted her resignation on Monday morning, along with a statement to the press that emphasized her shock and disappointment at Marcus's behavior. "I believed in his political message," she said in her statement, "but I cannot and will not support someone who would resort to violence to advance their agenda." The financial implications were becoming clear as well. Marcus's consulting contracts had all been terminated, his speaking engagements canceled, and his political action committee dissolved. The legal fees for his defense were mounting rapidly, and Prentice had already requested a significant retainer for his continued services. But perhaps the most crushing blow came from an unexpected source: his elderly parents, who had driven down from Scotland after seeing their son's humiliation broadcast on national television. His mother, Margaret Wellington, had always been his fiercest supporter, attending his campaign events and proudly telling her friends about her son's political career. "I don't understand how you could do such a thing," she said, sitting in his living room and looking at him with a mixture of disappointment and confusion that was more painful than any physical injury he had suffered. "We raised you to respect authority and to solve problems through proper channels. What were you thinking?" His father, Robert, was even more direct. "You've made fools of all of us, Marcus. Your mother can't even show her face at the church anymore, because everyone's talking about what you did. And for what? What did you possibly hope to accomplish by attacking that young soldier?" Marcus tried to explain his reasoning, but even to his own parents his justifications sounded hollow and self-serving. The more he talked, the clearer it became that his actions had been motivated not by political principle but by personal desperation and a pathological need for attention. The incident had indeed made him famous, just as he had hoped, but the nature of that fame was destroying every aspect of his life. Late-night television comedians were using footage of his encounter with the guard as material for their monologues. Social media was filled with memes that mocked his political ambitions and celebrated his humiliation. Someone had even created a satirical website called Marcus Wellington's Guide to Political Success that featured step-by-step instructions for ruining your career in under 10 seconds. The psychological impact was perhaps the hardest to bear. Marcus had always defined himself through his political activities and his public persona. Without those identities, he felt lost and purposeless. He had spent so many years focused on getting attention that he had never developed any real skills or interests outside of politics. Now, at 42 years old, he was facing the prospect of rebuilding his entire life from scratch. Sleep had become nearly impossible. Every time Marcus closed his eyes, he relived those terrible few seconds when his carefully planned publicity stunt had gone catastrophically wrong. He replayed the incident over and over, trying to imagine different outcomes, different approaches that might have achieved his goals without destroying his life. But the more he analyzed what had happened, the clearer it became that his fundamental assumptions had been wrong from the beginning. The Queen's Guard were not ceremonial props designed to stand motionless while civilians did whatever they wanted to them. They were highly trained military personnel with the skills and authority to protect themselves and maintain order during royal events. Marcus realized that his entire plan had been based on a fantasy. The fantasy that he could force others to give him the respect and attention he felt he deserved, without regard for their own dignity, training, or professional responsibilities. He had treated Sergeant Mitchell not as a person but as a prop in his own political theater, and the consequences of that dehumanizing attitude were now destroying everything he had worked to build. 6 months after the incident that destroyed his political career, Marcus Wellington sat in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the places where he might be recognized. His nose had healed, leaving only a slight bend that served as a permanent reminder of his moment of spectacular poor judgment. The bruising around his eyes had long since faded, but the damage to his reputation and his life remained as vivid as ever. The legal proceedings had finally concluded the previous month. Marcus had pleaded guilty to assault and breach of security, receiving a suspended 6-month prison sentence and a substantial fine that had consumed the last of his savings. The judge's remarks during sentencing had been particularly stinging, describing Marcus's actions as a selfish and reckless attempt to gain attention at the expense of public safety and military dignity. The media attention had eventually moved on to other stories, but the internet had made Marcus's humiliation permanent. The video of his encounter with Sergeant Mitchell had been viewed millions of times across various platforms, and it continued to resurface whenever people discussed political stunts gone wrong or the professionalism of the Queen's Guard. Marcus had been forced to declare bankruptcy 3 months earlier, unable to meet the mounting legal fees and with no source of income to replace his former political activities. His landlord had evicted him from the flat above the bakery after reporters continued to bother the other tenants, and he was now living in a small bedsit in a part of town he would once have looked down upon. Finding work had proved nearly impossible. His name was too recognizable, and employers were reluctant to hire someone whose face had become synonymous with poor judgment and public humiliation. Even applications for basic retail positions were being rejected once managers realized who he was. The few job interviews he had managed to secure were awkward affairs where potential employers spent more time asking about the incident than about his qualifications. One particularly uncomfortable meeting with the manager of a local supermarket had ended with the man actually pulling up the video on his phone to watch it again, shaking his head in disbelief as Marcus sat across from him trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. "I just don't understand what you were thinking," the manager had said, echoing the words that Marcus had heard from dozens of people over the past months. "I mean, everyone's seen the video. That guard laid you out cold and you deserved every bit of it." Marcus had tried to explain his motivations, but his explanations sounded increasingly hollow even to himself. The political principles he had claimed to be defending seemed laughably inadequate justification for the chaos and embarrassment he had caused. More and more, he was being forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that his actions had been driven not by noble ideals but by narcissism and desperation. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part of his new reality. Former friends and colleagues crossed the street to avoid him when they saw him in public. His phone, which had once buzzed constantly with calls from supporters and journalists, now sat silent for days at a time. The loneliness was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that he had brought it entirely upon himself. His relationship with his parents had slowly begun to heal, but it would never be the same. They still loved him, but their disappointment was palpable every time they spoke. His mother had stopped mentioning his name to her friends, and his father had taken down the photographs of Marcus's political campaigns that had once proudly decorated their living room. "We just want you to find some peace," his mother had said during their last phone conversation. "All that ambition, all that need to be important, where did it get you? You were so focused on being famous that you forgot how to be a decent person." The words had stung because they contained more truth than Marcus was comfortable confronting. Looking back on his political career, he could see that his motivations had become increasingly self-centered over the years. What had started as a genuine desire to serve his community had gradually transformed into an obsession with personal advancement and public recognition. The incident with the guard had been the logical endpoint of that trajectory, the moment when his need for attention had overwhelmed every other consideration, including basic human decency and respect for others. He had reduced Sergeant Mitchell to nothing more than a prop in his own publicity stunt, never considering the young soldier's dignity, training, or right to perform his duties without being attacked by attention-seeking politicians. Marcus had tried to reach out to Sergeant Mitchell through official channels, hoping to apologize for his actions, but his letters had gone unanswered. He understood why. What could he possibly say that would undo the humiliation and disruption he had caused? Mitchell had been doing his job, serving his country with honor and discipline, when Marcus had turned him into an unwilling participant in a political theater that benefited no one. The guard had handled the situation with remarkable professionalism, using exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. In the aftermath, military officials had praised Mitchell's restraint and quick thinking, noting that he had returned to his ceremonial position immediately after dealing with the disruption, as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Marcus's life had exploded in spectacular fashion. The contrast between Mitchell's disciplined professionalism and his own desperate attention-seeking could not have been more stark or more humiliating. As he sat in the cafe, nursing a cup of tea that he was making last as long as possible to justify his continued presence, Marcus reflected on the lessons that his spectacular failure had taught him. The pursuit of fame and attention for their own sake had cost him everything that actually mattered: his relationships, his financial security, his reputation, and his sense of self-worth. He thought about the person he had been before politics, consumed his life, before the constant need for public validation had turned him into someone he no longer recognized. There had been a time when he had been motivated by genuine desire to help others, when he had found satisfaction in small acts of service that never made headlines but made real differences in people's lives. Marcus pulled out a small notebook and began to write, not for publication or public consumption, but simply to organize his thoughts and figure out how to move forward. For the first time in years, he was thinking about what he wanted to accomplish rather than how he wanted to be perceived. Start small, he wrote. Find ways to help that don't require recognition. Rebuild trust through actions, not words. Accept that some mistakes can't be undone, but that doesn't mean redemption is impossible. It would be a long journey back to any kind of respectability, and Marcus knew that he would never again be able to pursue the political career that had once defined his identity. But perhaps there were other ways to serve, other ways to find, meaning that didn't depend on newspaper headlines or television interviews. The broken nose that Sergeant Mitchell had given him had healed, but the deeper wounds to his character and his relationships would take much longer to mend. As Marcus finished his tea and prepared to face another day in his diminished circumstances, he realized that the real work of rebuilding his life was just beginning. The man who had once dreamed of national political prominence was gone, destroyed by his own desperation and poor judgment in a few terrible seconds caught on camera for the world to see. What remained was the much harder task of figuring out who Marcus Wellington could become when the cameras weren't rolling and no one was watching.